Okay, so picture this. It's the 21st century, right? A time we think of as being all about republics, democracies,
Mm.
and yet you see these images from Nepal.
Mm.
Thousands of people in the streets.
Mm.
And they're not protesting for some radical new future. They're actually demanding the return of their king, a king they deposed not that long ago. It's surprising, isn't it?
It absolutely is, yeah. It really challenges how we usually think about, political progress. It's not the direction you expect things to move in.
Exactly. And that's what we're seeing in Nepal right now, these big protests happening across the country. And they're explicitly calling for the monarchy to be restored, for former King Gyanendra to come back.
Yeah.
And you've shared a fantastic set of sources with us for this deep dive, YouTube videos, transcripts.
Yeah.
They really give us a look inside this whole thing.
They do. And what's interesting, I think, is that they don't offer just one simple answer. You get different perspectives, the history, the current frustrations, maybe some nostalgia, political factors.
Right.
It's layered.
Which is perfect for our mission today.
Sure.
We want to take these sources you've given us and really dive deep. Let's unpack that history, figure out what's driving this movement now, and, think about what it would even mean if they did go back to a monarchy.
Right.
Honestly, my first reaction was just, why? Why would a country that fought to get rid of a monarchy with all its complicated history suddenly want it back? What's going on there?
It's a huge question, and the sources really show how deep it goes. History, identity, politics, all tangled up. It's not just about preferring one system over another, like on paper. It's tied to people's experiences, their disappointments, their hopes. Maybe even, like you said, a bit of romanticizing the past for some perceived stability.
Okay, so let's start peeling back those layers. To understand why people might want the monarchy back, we first need to understand where it came from in its whole journey, right?
Yeah.
Based on these sources.
Absolutely. You can't really talk about modern Nepal without talking about the Shah dynasty. They ruled for, over 240 years? It all kicks off with Prithvi Narayan Shah. He was the ruler of Gorkha, a small kingdom back then.
And the sources call him the unifier of the nation.
That's the term, yeah. He had this grand vision, especially for his time. He wanted to conquer and bring together all these little principalities scattered across the hills. The big prize, though, was the Kathmandu Valley.
Why the valley specifically?
Well, strategic location, for one, but also wealth. It sat on this key trade route between India and Tibet. So controlling the valley meant controlling trade, controlling money, controlling power. Shah knew that was the key.
But getting control wasn't straightforward. The sources talk about the siege of Kirtipur being particularly nasty.
Oh, yeah. A really tough and, frankly, grim part of the story. Kirtipur was well defended, and they fought back hard. The sources say it took Shah's forces, 4 attempts over 12 years? Yeah, and it cost him. He lost his top general, Kalu Pandey, even his own brother. And when Kirtipur finally fell in 1767, the sources describe this horrific act of retribution. Shah ordered the lips and noses of all the men in the town cut off.
Jesus, that's brutal.
It was a terrifying message to other cities in the valley about resisting him, and maybe symbolic, too, like they broke faith or something. It certainly sent shockwaves.
And it seemed to work, because the ruler of Kathmandu just fled.
Apparently so. The psychological impact must have been immense. Shah walked into Kathmandu, made it his capital in 1769, and that's really seen as the founding moment of modern Nepal, the start of the Shah dynasty's dominance.
The one source mentioned this nationalist view that Nepal kind of already existed, just scattered, and he assembled it.
Right, that's another perspective in there. Not that he created it from nothing, but that he was the one who saw the potential, the existing pieces, and put them together into one kingdom, a unifier, not just a conqueror.
Okay, so he builds the foundation, but then he dies relatively soon after, and things get messy immediately.
Very messy. Prithvi Narayan Shah died in 1775, just a few years after taking Kathmandu, and the court just dissolved into chaos. The big problem, no clear rules for who takes over. Kings had multiple wives, sometimes concubines. Which son from which wife gets the throne? It was a recipe for disaster.
Sounds like the start of that pattern of instability the sources keep mentioning.
It's absolutely central to it. That period, roughly 1777 to 1832, becomes this era of child kings. Young rulers obviously couldn't rule themselves, so power fell to regents, powerful, noble families.
Would use the kids as puppets.
Exactly. And these noble factions were just constantly fighting each other. The sources paint a picture of intense backstabbing, plots, assassinating rivals, forcing them into exile. Anything to grab power and control the key jobs in the government and army.
And loyalty wasn't really to the country, but to your own family faction.
Precisely. Your loyalty was to your clan, your family's power base, not to the crown as an institution or the idea of Nepal as a nation. And crucially, because of all this infighting, they never really built stable national institutions. Power was all about these personal, shifting, often violent family rivalries at court.
Which down the line creates the opening for the Ranas.
Exactly. That instability paved the way for the Rana family to take over, leading to that century where the Shah kings were kings in name only. It all came to a head with the Khat massacre in 1846. This was orchestrated by Jung Bahadur Rana.
He was a military guy.
Yeah, rising figure from a powerful noble family. He saw the chaos and played it brilliantly. The sources detail how he planned the massacre. He basically lured all the key players, his rivals, to the Khat palace courtyard.
Under false pretenses, right?
Yes, supposedly to investigate some earlier political murder. But it was an ambush, a total purge. The sources say nearly 40 top figures, ministers, generals, courtiers were killed that night. Just like that, his main opposition was gone.
And he seized control. But the key wasn't just becoming prime minister.
No, the masterstroke was making the position of prime minister along with the title Maharaja, hereditary within his own Rana family. That cemented their control. The Shah kings. They were kept on the throne sort of like symbols, but they had no real power. They were basically under house arrest, figureheads.
So for 100 years, the Shahs were puppet kings, as the sources say. How did the Ranas hold on for so long?
Well, they were definitely more organized about keeping power than the early Shahs had been. For one, they learned from the succession chaos. They set up clear rules for Rana succession based on seniority among eligible Rana men, not just birth order. That gave their regime stability at the top.
Okay.
They also clamped down hard on any opposition, limited freedoms, controlled information, and critically, they had the backing of British India. The British saw Rana ruled Nepal as a useful buffer state up against Tibet and China, so they supported the Ranas diplomatically, militarily. That support was vital.
The sources do mention they weren't just sitting still, though. Some modernization happened.
Yeah, it wasn't total stagnation. They did build some roads, administrative buildings, set up the first proper schools, a postal system. So alongside the autocratic rule, there were some developments, even if driven by Rana interests.
And then, the big change. India gets independence in 1947.
Huge turning point. Suddenly, the Ranas lost their main international backer, the British. And the new Indian government, Nehru and the Congress Party, they were pro-democracy. They weren't fans of this autocratic regime right on their border. Their preference was, maybe keep the king, but definitely open things up politically.
Which created an opportunity for anti-Rana forces.
Absolutely. Nepalese, who were organizing against the Ranas, many based in India and inspired by the independence movement there, saw their chance. And crucially, they teamed up with the reigning Shah king, King Tribhuvan. He was also tired of being powerless under the Ranas.
And his escape to India, that was a big moment, wasn't it?
Really dramatic. In 1950, he was supposedly going on a hunting trip, but instead he diverted to the Indian embassy in Kathmandu and asked for asylum. India flew him to Delhi. Now, you could see it as just saving himself, but the sources highlight how it was spun and how many Nepalese saw it as the king risking everything for his people, for democracy.
That symbolism must have been powerful when he returned.
Immensely. The Ranas were forced to negotiate, largely brokered by India, and they gave up power in 1951. Tribhuvan came back a hero, the Shah monarchy was back in the driver's seat, and he promised democracy. That image, the king who sacrificed, was so strong that even later when people turned against the monarchy, they often still respected Tribhuvan.
But going from centuries of autocracy to democracy, that couldn't have been easy.
Not at all. The years right after 1951, despite the promises, were super unstable. Trying to form governments, figure out how democracy works after so long, it was really challenging, a tough transition period.
And King Mahendra, Tribhuvan's son, who took over in 55, the sources suggest he saw this instability differently.
Yeah, that's the picture they paint. Mahendra came to the throne amid all this political chaos. He's described as ambitious, traditional about the monarchy's role, but also wanting to modernize Nepal under his control. He seems to have looked at the squabbling parties and thought, see, democracy doesn't work here. The king needs to be in charge.
He did allow elections in 1959, though. B.B. Koirala became PM.
He did. That was a major step, Nepal's first real democratic election. Koirala and the Nepali Congress won, but Mahendra's patience, according to the sources, was incredibly thin. Just 18 months later, in December 1960, he basically said, this parliamentary democracy thing is a failure.
And staged a royal coup.
Pretty much.
Right.
Dismissed the government, suspended the constitution, banned political parties, arrested Koirala and hundreds of others.
And brought in his own system, the panchayat.
Exactly. A partyless system, but really all power was centralized under him, the king. The sources call him a kind of benevolent dictator. He did push some modernizing reforms, land reform, laws against caste discrimination, but always the goal was royal authority. He genuinely seemed to believe parties were bad for Nepal, and only the king could provide stability and progress.
And that system lasted until his son, Birendra, took the throne.
Right. Birendra became king in 1972. He inherited a country where unhappiness with the panchayat system was definitely growing beneath the surface. Plus, there was this bit of folklore hanging over him. He was the 10th Shah king, and this old curse supposedly said the dynasty would end with the 11th. A little ominous.
Adds to the pressure, I guess.
Maybe. Anyway, despite the controlled system, pressure for change kept building. There were big student riots in '79. That pushed Birendra to hold a referendum. Keep panchayat or bring back multi-party democracy.
And panchayat won.
Narrowly. There were accusations of rigging, but officially it won. Still, the demand for democracy didn't go away.
And it all exploded in the 1990 pro-democracy movement.
Yeah, that was huge. Nationwide protests, led mainly by the Nepali Congress and the Communists, the UML, who'd been operating underground or semi-underground. Hundreds of thousands hit the streets, demanding an end to panchayat. And the government cracked down hard at first, violently.
But King Birendra then did something unexpected.
He did. The sources really emphasize this point, apparently. Seeing his own citizens being killed by security forces really affected him. So in April 1990, he gave in. He agreed to end the panchayat system and become a constitutional monarch. A new constitution came in 1990 that stripped him of most executive powers, giving them to an elected government.
And that decision wasn't popular within the palace.
Apparently not. The sources suggest he was kind of alone in embracing this democratic shift. His stepmother, Queen Ratna, his wife, Queen Aishwarya, and crucially, his brother Yanendra, they were reportedly pretty unhappy about giving up royal power. It shows that old pattern of family factionalism was still alive and well.
Okay, so 1990 brings constitutional monarchy, multi-party democracy. But the problems didn't just vanish.
Not by a long shot. That whole period after 1990, while democratic on paper, was still plagued by instability. Governments changed constantly, coalition squabbles, infighting, corruption scandals. The economy didn't really take off, poverty stayed high.
And this is when the Maoist insurgency starts brewing.
Exactly. Another major turning point. The Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, led by Prachanda, emerges around 1994. Their argument, as the sources laid out, was basically, this new democracy, it's fake, it's just the same old corrupt elites running things, it won't fix poverty or inequality, we need a revolution. So they launched their People's War.
Kicking off the Civil War in 1996.
Yeah, a really brutal decade-long conflict. The Maoists used guerrilla tactics, hit government targets, police stations, especially in rural areas where the state was weak. And they actually gained quite a bit of support, particularly among marginalized groups, partly by setting up their own local governments and providing basic services the state wasn't delivering.
And the government response fueled the fire, too.
It often did. Both sides committed terrible human rights abuses. The government's military response under the monarchy was often heavy-handed, according to the sources. Civilian casualties, alienation. It just drove more people towards the Maoists. Thousands died, huge numbers were displaced. It was a devastating period. Plus, you had India backing the government, worried about Maoism spreading, and maybe China quietly supporting the Maoists. Very complex.
So civil war, political instability,
Yeah.
and then the royal massacre in 2001. Just unbelievable.
Utterly shocking. A national trauma. June 1st, 2001. King Birendra, the Queen, several other close family members, all shot dead during a family dinner at the palace. The official story pinned it on the Crown Prince Dipendra, who supposedly then shot himself and died a few days later.
But the sources make it really clear, tons of controversy, conspiracy theories.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody fully bought the official story. Theories flew around. Was it about Dipendra's marriage choice? Was it a power grab by someone else? Maybe his uncle Janendra. The sources even mention how unusual it is, killing your own parents, even in mythology. It just left this huge cloud of suspicion and grief.
And in the aftermath, Gyanendra becomes king.
Yes. Birendra's brother, Gyanendra, was crowned just days later. And as one source points out, it was actually his second time being crowned. He'd been king briefly as a toddler back in 1950 when Trihuvin fled. Talk about an inauspicious start this time around, inheriting the throne after your brother and his family are massacred amidst all that suspicion and national trauma.
His reign didn't last long, though. It led directly to the end of the monarchy.
Pretty much. Initially, maybe people hoped he'd bring some stability after the shock, but his popularity faded fast. Partly because the Civil War was still raging and he didn't seem to be solving it, but mostly because he clearly wanted to grab back royal power.
Which he did in February 2005.
Exactly. He used the excuse of the failing politicians and the Maoist threat, suspended the Constitution, fired the government, declared himself absolute monarch, said it was necessary to restore order, but everyone saw it for what it was, a royal coup. He shut down the press, jailed activists.
And that triggered a massive backlash.
Huge. People were furious. April 2006, you get the Jaina Andol the Second People's Movement. All the major political parties, even the Maoists, eventually joined in, demanding democracy back. Massive protests, strikes, civil disobedience across the country. Largely peaceful, but huge pressure.
And Gyanendra had to give in.
He had no choice. The pressure was overwhelming, internationally, too. April 24th, 2006, he brings back Parliament. But that wasn't the end of it. Parliament, reflecting the public mood, immediately passed laws stripping him of pretty much all his powers. He became purely ceremonial overnight.
Setting the stage for abolition in 2008.
Right. After the 2006 movement, there was a peace deal signed between the government and the Maoists, brokered by the UN. Maoists joined an interim government. The deal was a new constituent assembly would be elected, it would write a new constitution, and it would decide the fate of the monarchy.
The Maoists wanted it gone immediately, though.
They pushed for that initially, yeah, but eventually agreed to let the assembly decide. There were delays getting the election organized, but it finally happened in April 2008. And guess who won the most seats? The Maoists, now a political party.
So the first meeting of that assembly must have been quite something.
Historic. May 28, 2008. The Constituent Assembly meets for the first time, and their first major act, voting overwhelmingly to declare Nepal a democratic republic. Just like that, 240 years of Shah monarchy gone. Gyanendra was formally stripped of his role, had to leave the palace.
And how did people react at the time?
The sources say it was mostly celebration, a real sense of hope. People felt like finally they were free from the monarchy, the Civil War. They could build a new, stable, democratic future. Lots of optimism.
But fast forward to today, and that optimism seems to have faded for many. The Republic has faced massive challenges.
It really has. I mean, they inherited huge problems. Poverty, inequality, the scars of the Civil War. But the thing the sources really hammer home is the political dysfunction. Constant infighting, instability.
And that statistic you mentioned really drives it home.
It's pretty staggering, isn't it? Since 2008, when the monarchy ended, one source says Nepal has had 14 different governments.
14 and 17 years.
Yeah. They call it a revolving door of coalition politics.
Yeah.
Prime ministers change, coalitions collapse, just constant churn. And they even noted, when the source was made, that everyone was already predicting the 14th government wouldn't last long either.
And this chaos isn't just political theater. It hits people's daily lives, especially the economy.
Absolutely. The sources directly link this instability to economic frustration, high inflation eating away at savings, and just this pervasive feeling of corruption being rampant, money getting siphoned off instead of going to development.
They list specific scandals.
Yeah, things like the Lalita Nuwas land grab, the white body airplane deal, the Sudan scam, all happening under the Republic. But, to be fair, the sources are careful to say corruption isn't new. They mention the carpet scandal back in the Panchayat days, even an allegation involving King Gyanendra himself with Omega watches before he became absolute monarch. The point seems to be corruption runs deep. It wasn't just a monarchy problem or just a republic problem.
And unemployment, especially youth unemployment, is a massive issue, driving discontent.
Huge. The sources highlight this again and again. Young people can't find work. And get this number. At one point, they mentioned 65,000 young Nepalese leaving the country every single month to find work overseas.
Wow, that's a brain drain.
An enormous one. It signals real despair. Add to that the long-term effects of the war, the hit from COVID on tourism and remittances. It's been tough.
Though the sources do mention some recent positive signs.
They do offer a little balance there. They talk about maybe 4% growth projected for 2024, tourism bouncing back strongly, remittances are high, hydropower is growing, good rice harvest, so signs of life. But,
and this is the key thing they stress, it's not enough. It's not fast enough. It's not reaching everyone, and it's not solving those deep-seated problems. And there are warnings, like from the World Bank, about investment declining, maybe due to government cuts.
So basically, all this disappointment, the political chaos, the economic struggles, the corruption, it feeds this disillusionment with the current system.
Exactly. People hoped for democracy to bring stability, prosperity, clean government. When they see the opposite, that hope dies.
Mm.
They get fed up with the politicians, fed up with the system as it's working, or rather, not working.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The pro-monarchy movement gaining ground in 2025.
It's a direct consequence of that disillusionment. People are saying, well, this democracy experiment feels like it failed, or maybe the politicians failed democracy. Either way, they're looking for an alternative.
Mm.
And some are turning back to the monarchy, maybe romanticizing it a bit, seeing it as a possible fix for the country's problems, its malaise.
And we've seen these rallies picking up steam since last year. Yeah, they've become much more visible. The sources give us some specific dates and events from early 2025 that really show this trend.
Like Gyanendra himself getting involved.
Right. February 19th, that's a holiday. Celebrating Prithvi Narayan Shah, the former king, releases this video message, basically urging people to support bringing the monarchy back. And that did seem to spark more protests.
Then there was that big welcome for him in Kathmandu in March.
Yeah, March 9th. He flew back to Kathmandu, and thousands of supporters met him at the airport, escorted him home in this big procession. Estimates vary wildly, thousands, maybe over 10,000. Monarchists claimed way more, like 400,000, but that seems unlikely. Still, it was big enough to need thousands of police. A real show of support.
But then things turned violent later that month.
Tragically, yes. March 28th, a pro-monarchy rally in Kathmandu, specifically demanding restoration, ended in violence. Clashes, police used tear gas, and the sources report 2 people were killed by gunfire, dozens injured. Awful.
Which led to political fallout.
Yeah. The ruling parties were furious. They called for Gyanendra to be fined, even arrested, accusing him of basically stirring up the trouble that led to the deaths.
And the protests have continued since then.
It seems so. Maybe not huge daily events everywhere, but the sources suggest they're still popping up into April 2025 and beyond. The movement hasn't just fizzled out. And the Rastriya Prajatantra Party, the RPP, they were founded by monarchist allies back in the 90s. They're seen as a major force organizing a lot of this.
Okay, so let's get into the core debate presented in these sources. What are the actual arguments for bringing the king back, and what are the counter-arguments? Is the king really seen as a potential savior?
Well, the main argument you hear from proponents in the sources boils down to stability. They look at the 14 governments in 17 years and say, see, this Republican system is chaotic. The belief is that a king, standing above the political mess, could provide consistent leadership, a steady hand. Some polls mentioned in the sources even suggest, maybe surprisingly, that over half the population might want him back, driven by that desire for stability.
And there's a connection to national identity too, right? Especially the Hindu state idea.
A very strong connection. For groups like the RPP, a big part of the platform is returning Nepal to being officially a Hindu state, which it was before the republic became secular. They feel a constitutional monarchy could help restore that identity, that cultural unity they think has been lost in all the political fighting. The king is presented as more than just a political figure. He's a symbol of history continuity and this idea of an intimate.
A guardian figure.
Yeah, a guardian. Someone above party politics who treats everyone the same, who can unite the country like, they argue, Prithvi Narayan Shah united the small states way back when. Someone to hold things together when the parties are tearing it apart.
And there's also this hope he could fight corruption.
It's definitely part of the appeal for some, maybe not that the king himself would be perfectly clean, but that as this guardian, he could act as a check on the politicians, stop the worst excesses. There's a quote from the RPP leader in one source saying, the king's job isn't necessarily to do good, but to stop the bad from happening.
And even better diplomacy is mentioned.
Yeah, a minor point perhaps, but some look back at old clips of kings meeting world leaders and suggest a monarch could represent Nepal better internationally.
Okay, so that's the case for. But the sources offer plenty of pushback and skepticism.
Oh, absolutely. And often, the counter-arguments use the monarchy's own history against it. Critics hit back hard on the stability argument. They say, hang on, look at the actual history. They point to all that instability after Prithvi Narayan Shah, the century of Rana puppet kings, King Mahendra throwing out democracy in 1960, and especially King Gyanendra's own power grab in 2005, dismissing parliament, jailing critics. That doesn't exactly scream stable, benevolent leadership.
And they bring up corruption under the monarchy, too.
Right. To counter the king as anti-corruption guardian idea, they remind people of things like the carpet scandal during the Panchayat era, implicating people high up in the king's system, and that alleged Omega Watch incident where Gyanendra supposedly asked for a 50% cut in a company planning to invest, causing them to pull out. The point is, corruption isn't new, and the monarchy wasn't immune. It's a deeper problem.
Gyanendra's own track record from 2005 is obviously a big factor for critics.
Definitely. They say, look at what he actually did when he had absolute power briefly. It was repression, not good governance. The idea that putting him back now would magically fix things just doesn't square with that recent history for them.
There's also the practical question. How would a guardian king actually work without causing chaos?
That's a really important structural point raised in the sources. Okay, so the king is supposed to stop bad things. How? Does he have constitutional power to veto the government? If he does, won't that just lead to constant fights between the palace and the elected parliament? Like that clash mentioned between the president and PM over the army chief. How much power does this guardian get? Who decides what's bad? It sounds like a recipe for more gridlock, not less.
And the critics say the monarchists don't really have a plan for the real problems.
Yeah, that's a key criticism. Okay, you want the king back, fine. But how is that going to fix inflation? How will it create jobs so 65,000 young people don't leave every month? What's the actual economic policy? The sources suggest the monarchist side talks a lot about the current system's failures, but doesn't offer concrete solutions, just the idea that things will somehow get better under the king.
Plus, the fear that it could just lead back to autocracy.
That's a deep-seated fear, based on history. Look at Mahendra, look at Gyanendra. Even if you brought the monarchy back as purely ceremonial, critics worry that given the historical tendency of Shah kings to consolidate power, it would only be a matter of time before they try to become autocratic, again, undermining democracy completely.
And finally, the argument that maybe the problem isn't the system, democracy, but the people running it.
That comes through strongly, too. That democracy itself hasn't failed, but the politicians have failed to make it work. Their infighting, their corruption, their lack of vision. That's the problem. And comparing Gyanendra today to someone like Prithvinarayan Shah centuries ago, or even Mahendra, it's apples and oranges. The context is totally different. The question is, what would Gyanendra do now? And critics say his recent past isn't reassuring.
So it's way more complicated than just monarchy versus republic. The sources also touch on other ways to find that unity people seem to be craving.
Yeah, amidst all the arguments, there's this recognition of a genuine desire in Nepal for something unifying, something to bridge the divides caused by party politics and ideology.
And they float this idea of constitutional nationalism.
Right, as an alternative way to get that unity. Instead of relying on one person, like a king, the idea is to find unity in the Constitution itself. A constitution that genuinely treats everyone the same, no matter what language they speak, what they look like, where they live, what religion they follow, what political beliefs they hold.
Making people feel like the country belongs to all of them equally.
Exactly. That phrase, "Thamka ma kangan," the state belongs to everyone. It's shared. If people truly feel that sense of shared ownership rooted in the Constitution, that could be a really powerful unifying force, much more stable than relying on any single leader.
But the sources acknowledge there's a gap between the ideal and reality.
For sure. Nepal has a constitution from 2015 that says all the right things about equality. But the sources suggest that feeling of being treated equally, that sense of shared ownership, maybe it's not quite there in practice for everyone. Start vacuuming in practice. You have to see it in practice, feel it in your daily life for it to mean something.
And that gap might be exactly why people are feeling disillusioned now.
It seems connected. The argument is if the Republic had managed to create that genuine feeling of shared, equal citizenship through its constitution and how the state operates, maybe people wouldn't feel so guardian-less. Maybe they wouldn't be looking back to the past, flaws and all, if they had more hope in the present and future, delivering on that promise of equality and progress for everyone.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've traced Nepal's history, the rise and fall of the monarchy, the struggles of the republic, and really dug into the arguments around this surprising movement calling for the king's return, all drawing from the sources you shared.
It paints a picture of a nation really wrestling with its present, feeling let down by the promises of democracy, and looking back, perhaps selectively, at a monarchical past that, as we've seen, was also full of instability and problems. It's clear no system yet has been a magic wand in Nepal.
And just to reiterate, we've tried to lay out the different viewpoints from those sources as impartially as possible, just exploring the ideas without taking sides ourselves.
Absolutely. The aim was just to understand the history, the context, the arguments that are shaping this current moment based on the materials provided.
So, for you listening, as you process all this, it really brings up some big questions, doesn't it? Questions that go way beyond Nepal, like what does truly unite a diverse country? How do you get stability and good governance and accountability? Can you have one without the other? And maybe the biggest one, does real change come from waiting for the right leader, a king, a hero, or does it come from the hard, ongoing work of building strong, fair institutions and making sure everyone feels they have a stake in the system?
It definitely makes you think about why people get disillusioned with politics and where they turn when that happens.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Based on everything we've discussed from the sources, we've seen this cycle of instability, corruption, power grabs, whether under kings or parties. It seems like a recurring theme, maybe even a human tendency for those in power to want more of it. So the real challenge, maybe not just for Nepal, but for any society, is how do you build a system that ensures accountability and progress regardless of who's in charge? What are the checks, the balances, the civic structures needed so that people feel represented, feel secure, and actually have hope for the future, no matter who holds the top job?